This entire week, we've been talking about the Orks, a menace from 40k that functionally is like a green stain upon the galaxy. And in yesterday's video, we put the boys themselves under a microscope and looked at some of the ways that they can grow and evolve and how their interest in weapons and vehicles lead them down these extremely diverse paths and make this army very, very unique depending on what interests you. But today I want to talk about my favorite part of the faction, the toys. That is to say, the Orks are incredibly adept at engineering and building, these incredible sci-fi tech, but it's almost universally unstable junk that's been duct taped together. This adaptability to build whatever they need with the parts on hand makes the Orks a true menace to the Imperium. Because if you throw warriors and tanks and aircraft at the Orks to try and kill them, and you don't kill them quickly enough, they're going to start using the wreckage of those things to build increasingly more complex and insane war machines to throw right back at you. Now, just like the other kinds of units, there are a ton of vehicles, big and small, and while I will probably do a Speed Freaks week in the future, I just wanted to touch on some of the newer and more iconic vehicles that really shape this army. This is by no means exhaustive, and I am going to do a second video talking about the big, huge things like the Gorgonaut, Morkonaut, and Stompa, stuff like that. But I wanted to kick off this episode talking about what I'm going to consider to be the Ork vehicle elephant in the room, and that is the Speed Freaks, a collection of vehicles released in the last year or two that really made a full mechanized Ork more of a reality. You, of course, could play something like that before, but this just added a lot of options. So we'll start off by looking at the Warbike. Not a new kit, but they fit so well into these other speedy vehicles that I had to put them in. And what constitutes a Warbike varies quite a bit. At its most basic, it's just a way for an Ork to sit atop a deafeningly loud motor, rush headlong into the enemy, and have a big smile on his face while doing so. In practice, these are not terribly dissimilar from human motorcycles, 2 wheels, single rider, things like that, and they use these as platforms to bolt on all manner of weapons. They often function as the vanguard or outriders for an army, using their speed and aggression to be the first into the fight, and hopefully peeling away some of the enemies before the rest of the war clan shows up. Then there are the Mega Track Scrap Jets. The Orks employ a number of flyers in their army that we'll touch on here in a bit, but the consistent problem that they have with these aircraft is that Orks really aren't great at not getting shot down. Especially when you look at the bombers who have to fly super low to drop their payload. So, when mechs see the fuselage of a plane just lying in a scrap heap, they may think, well, I guess it doesn't like being in the air, and so they fix up a plane, bolt on some wheels, and now it's a car. More specifically, a murder mobile. These guys still do strafing runs like they did when they were in the sky, but just on the ground level. They act as a giant missile. All guns firing forward, just shooting headlong into the enemy like a spear, and if they're alive at the other end, they just turn around and do it again, just like a strafing run. After that, there is the Boomdaka Snaz Wagon and Custom Boosta Blasta, 2 vehicles I'll do at once, but they're both light vehicles, which means an array of armaments, both built on scrapped remains of other vehicles and outfitted with comically overpowered engines. There's not really much to them lore-wise. They use them for races and things like that, but for the most part, this is kind of an all-encompassing term. Then there is the Shock Jump Dragsta, which is a light vehicle like the other ones we talked about, but this one has a teleportation device on the tail of it. So it's just like Back to the Future style, right? Blinking around the battlefield, firing off any guns they can strap to it. The vehicles we just mentioned here, the Boomdaka Snazwagon, Custom Boosta Blasta, Shock Jump Dragsta, they're all very light vehicles with not a ton of weaponry to them. But that kind of changes when we start talking about the Ruck-a-Truck Skwig Buggies, which is basically a pickup truck full of different breeds of weaponized squigs. Then we didn't talk about squigs much this week. These are small creatures that the Orks use as food and beasts of burden, but some of them are bred specifically to be explosive or toxic or something like that. They weaponize them by breeding them correctly. And so this is just a truck that is loaded to the gills with these dangerous Skwiggs, and they spend the battle crashing into the enemy and hurling their payload out, almost out like a crude land bomber. It's just a guy hucking Skwiggs out of the back of his truck. Then we come to my personal favorite of kind of the speedy side of the army, I guess you could say, and that is the Def-Killa Wartrike. This is the chosen ride of an orc speed boss. Take a mega boss, right, and put him, his mega boss being the meanest, biggest orc there is, and put him on a tricycle with more engine power than anything else. And you let him tear directly in the enemy as long as all the other vehicles can keep up with him. He even has a claw that acts kind of like a harpoon, which is super cool. All these vehicles we've talked about so far, with the exception of the bikes, they kind of fill very similar roles in terms of they're all light vehicles that can put out a good amount of damage. You don't want to ignore them, but they're not super huge threats. But what we're going to talk on going forward here is some of the bigger, heavier weapons that you have to deal with quickly. And I think probably a great way to segue into some of the other vehicles is with the flyers, because they're kind of like an offset of the speed freaks, right? There are 4 in the orc arsenal. There's the WAAAGH, Blitzabomber, Burnabomber, Wazbomb, Blastajets. And while they do fill different roles within the army, I just wanted to add that it takes a special kind of crazy to fly any of these machines, even by orc standards. If you haven't picked up on it before now, the orc engineering doesn't exactly meet safety standards. So you're just as likely to explode from, say, an engine malfunction than you are from an enemy firing at you. So these orcs are so desperate to go fast and to ride high and to sit on the loudest engine ever, they clamor to be a pilot. And so I kind of view these as like a weird, awkward cousin to the speed freaks that we saw before with all the vehicles on ground. Now, there's not a lot of lore to these individually, so I'll just knock them out here. The WAAAGH is a very simple one. It's a dogfighter, an air-to-air fighter meant to keep the orcs in control of the aerial arena. To this end, the boy flying it has a mech strap every gun that they can find to its body. Then they fly like a madman, making ridiculous maneuvers that confound Imperial pilots, and use a quantity over quality strategy when it comes to firing at a target. Basically, it's just a plane that's just strapped to the gills with guns, trying to fire down other planes. In the most intense moments of a dogfight, the pilot often busts out his own window, so he can pull his pistol and start shooting along with every other gun in the plane. That's just how intense these guys are. Next is the Blitzabomber. This is quite simply a bomber variant of the same plane. It forgoes some of the guns strapped to the hull in favor of carrying massive ordnance to annihilate big targets like vehicles, knights, things like that. But the issue that orcs have is that they don't have time to learn, trajectories and math, and to be honest, if you're not familiar with it, there's a lot of math involved in dropping a bomb. So instead of doing all of the hard work, instead they just straight up nosedive at the enemy, hopefully pulling up at the absolute last second, and when you're so close, it gets harder and harder to miss with the bomb. While it's likely one of the most dangerous vehicles to pilot, the resulting blast is always worth it for those orcs that survive. Next is the Burnabomber. This one is short and sweet. It functions like a bomber, but its payload is a little bit different. Instead of, a handful of these huge mega bombs that are meant to sink vehicles and stuff like that, it flies over enemy troops and drops a bunch of incendiary payloads, setting the enemy ablaze to devastating effect. So it's not quite as, bunker busting as the other bomber is, but it is still anti-infantry focused. It's dropping something on troops. This stems from the orcs' desire to combine all their favorite things like speed, volume, fire, and then you have Burna Boys on the ground who just watch this godlike curtain of flames just descend upon the battlefield, and they love it. And the last of these flyers is the Wazbomb Blastaject. And this one is super cool. You see, when a clan has a whole bunch of mechs, they can sometimes form a little competition to see who can build the best jet, cause the most destruction, and survive to fight again. And so this competition sets mechs on a frantic building spree. Blastajets act as their elite aircraft in the orc army, equipped with crude force fields to absorb incoming damage and a slew of very exotic weaponry. This is, of course, to destroy the enemy, and vehicles to scrap for parts to keep the competition going. And while there's not a whole lot of lore here other than like, wow, these are super awesome planes that, you know, mechs spend quality time in, they're all custom, but really I just love the idea of this competition happening to see who can do the most damage, who can push the limits further. And it's funny that they're, you know, in that sense of pushing things to the line, defense is like just then creeping into the orc mindset, or having a shield to defend you is like the afterthought of all this. But I want to pull away from talking about more of the speedier stuff and talk about some of the more classic, more iconic units that make up some of the vehicles and things like that. And that's two of them really, Killicans and Death Dreads. These are some of my favorite units in the Orc army. These are both crude walking machines of the Orcs. They sort of act as like a dreadnought equivalent for the Orc army. And these two variants, the Killican and Death Dread, share a lot of similarities. Both are these mechanical monstrosities piloted by a lucky or unugly greenskin, armed with all manner of deadly weapon, and they basically just throw them at the enemy. Where they differ is in the pilots. Killicans are piloted by grots, a term for the tiny little goblins that make up the servant class of the orc culture. And after a lifetime of being bullied and bossed around, they fight for each other for a chance to pilot a Killican. And the only thing that can really dissuade them from this is if they witness the terrifying implantation process, because it is quite gruesome. Basically, they render the body useless and they jam the grot's brain full of sensors and electrodes, and they connect him into the Killican itself. Now, oftentimes, upon becoming a Killican, the first reaction of the grot here is to turn and pulverize anyone who's ever bullied them in the past. Which might sound really annoying, really frustrating that you're hurting your own guys, but the reason they're so great is because Killicans are smaller than Death Dreads and cheaper to make, and grots are plentiful. And like I said, these grots are all too happy for a chance to feel like an all-powerful god. You know, compared to how strong they usually are, being able to have like buzzsaw arms and tear orcs in half just feels good. And the Death Dreads, as we talked about, are largely the same thing, just on a bigger scale. The big difference here is motivation. Some orcs see entering a Death Dread as an easy means to power, right? Surely when I'm in this Death Dread and I'm commanding, you know, my new body is this big mega killer with missiles and buzzsaws and stuff, certainly that'll make me the mega boss, because I'll be the biggest and the bestest. But upon realizing that they are now trapped inside this new war machine body, they go a little bit mad. It's just not what orcs were made for. And therefore, they don't really have a whole lot of leadership potential. Also, the fact that they are now entirely dependent on docks and mechs to stay in the fight means they're not going to make it very long as a war boss, who are very independent creatures. Docks are super important for both of these machines, as are mechs, because it's their continued skills. We talked about in my video yesterday how those two lines of thought, the biology and the engineering, go hand in hand. And in this case, we have, you know, you're basically hot wiring a janky machine that the mech built to the brain of an orc, and that's where the dock comes in. Now, as I mentioned before, there are a ton more vehicles, and I definitely want to do dedicated video like this to cover them. We haven't even touched on the mighty battle wagon, you know, the Gorkanaut, Morkanaut, and the Stompa, all kinds of cool stuff. But I hope you enjoyed this little bit of, I don't know, lore, background, just talking about some of the models that are really cool. And so, as with all these videos, I want to end this one talking about why are the orc vehicles so awesome. Orc creations define the army. What we're seeing is their form of creativity, and indeed the way that they use these things all scrapped together and bolted on is creative. But all of the allure of that quickly fades away when you consider that all of these things are meant to be as deadly as possible. Because for a moment, try to put this and the last video that we did together. Imagine you're a simple guardsman, which is the kind of the closest analog to an average person we have, and you hear a weird buzzing. And the sky darkens as a fleet of bombas and burnabombas flood over and just drop their payload on you. And when you peek out of your cover from that, you look over and you see this endless tide of green orcs running at you, screaming. Between the roar of deafening engines and the green tide, they're just coming at you too quickly to really hold a defense. And when that swarm hits you with bikes and cars and greenskins and just guys yelling who are carrying like a random axe that they found, it's gonna hit you like a wave crashing over a rock. Machines that shouldn't function tear into your defenses, ripping them apart, and madness ensues. Likely the last thing you hear is the roar of motors and the laughter from the orc who's steering it. It's one of those things, like, individually, there's not a lot of lore or things that are deeply fascinating about each of these units. As you can tell, I kind of breezed through a lot of them. But the truth is, when you put it all together and you try to imagine what an orc invasion is like, it is a truly terrifying thing. It's an assault on the senses, both visually with the magnitude of what's happening because there's so many of them, but then audibly, and then you can feel the ground tremble because of all the footsteps and the vehicles. It's just a lot. These are amazing models, and there's a lot of ways to make them your own in a kit bash to your heart's content. This truly is one of like those armies that just stand apart as, like, if you're like an intense modeler, you can just go nuts and have a great time with these. Now, as far as my pick for favorite vehicle, I gotta go Killacan. I love the idea of strapping this tiny little vindictive, greedy little grot inside of this thing and giving him power. And he's not like superpower on a grand scale of things, but to him, he feels like he's God. The god of war, just like trouncing around the camp. I absolutely think that's hilarious just because of his lack of perspective. But I'd love to know your thoughts. What is your favorite of these vehicles? If I had to pick one of the Speed Freaks, I'm definitely going to go with the Boomdaka Snazwagon, just for looks. I absolutely love it. So anyway, tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you so much for joining me this week as we explored the Orks from 40k. I look forward to seeing you in my next 40k lore week. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. Happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.